HOA. That's all you really need to hear to know trouble is coming, but I never imagined they would go as far as burning my grandpa's historic cabin to get their way. The moment I saw those scorched timbers and the swirling ash drifting across the old orchard, I felt my stomach knot up like I was back in a combat zone. I'm Colonel Adrian A.J. Woodward. I've served 3 tours overseas, led men through deserts and jungles, and seen my fair share of destruction. But I never thought the ugliest battlefield I'd face would be my own hometown, courtesy of an overbearing homeowners association and its ruthless president. I stood amid the wreckage, blinking against the smoke. My grandfather built that cabin by hand nearly 70 years ago. It was more than just wood and nails. It was family history. It was the symbol of an entire community's pioneer spirit. And now it lay reduced to crumbling beams, crackling embers, and the memory of a place once filled with laughter and warmth. The acrid smell of char clung to my uniform jacket as I crouched low, sifting through the remains of a rocking chair Grandpa had carved himself. I remembered sitting there on quiet afternoons. I'd listened to him spin tales about neighbors banding together back when folks cared for one another. Now all I could see was twisted metal, blackened planks, and my reflection in a puddle of muddy water streaked with soot. Across the field, a few neighbors peeked through their curtains. I sensed their fear. The local rumor mill had already churned out 6 theories about who set the fire. But I had no doubt. The cabin stood on a patch of land the HOA wanted for themselves, and the new president, Karen Alder, had repeatedly warned me that they wouldn't accept a military man defying their will. I didn't immediately report the incident to the city police. I had my reasons. First, I wanted proof. Second, I knew from experience that in small towns like ours, you can't always trust official channels. Corruption had crept in. A couple of city council members had suspiciously close ties to the local developers who donated thousands for re-election campaigns. Karen, well-connected and cunning, had once bragged about a phone full of politicians' direct numbers. If I rushed to the station with an accusation but no evidence, her influence could turn everything against me. So I took pictures of every angle of the rubble. I logged the timeline in my old field notebook. Then I pulled out a charred piece of the sign Grandpa had nailed above the door, Woodward Homestead in 1953, and resolved that I'd see justice done, whether through official courts or otherwise. The next morning, I got a call from one of my platoon buddies, Nate Brown, who'd retired and become a private investigator. His voice crackled with the same directness I remembered from missions abroad. He could tell I was on edge. He asked how I was holding up, and I told him the truth. Fury coursed through my veins. He offered to drive down and help me figure out exactly who was behind this atrocity. I told him I'd appreciate the assistance. I wanted to move carefully, gather indisputable evidence, and then strike. No half measures. When I approached the entrance to our suburban enclave, I noticed that the once humble sign had been replaced with an ornate arch reading Rolling Acres, an HOA community. It looked more like a fortress gate than a welcoming sign. I could almost picture Karen standing there in her typical stiff posture, scanning for any violations of her beloved bylaws. From what I'd learned, she was known for mailing out threats over lawn heights, mailbox designs, and unauthorized fence colors. Yet her thirst for control didn't end with routine enforcement. She had apparently set her sights on expanding Rolling Acres onto land that wasn't strictly under the HOA's jurisdiction. That land included my grandpa's property. I parked my Jeep, exhaled slowly, and marched straight to the association's makeshift office. It was a small building near the communal tennis courts. Ironically, the courts had gone unused since Karen implemented a booking system so convoluted that no one bothered. The moment I entered, I spotted 2 middle-aged men rummaging through boxes labeled HOA Financials. They glanced up, saw my uniform, and froze. One with a name badge reading Doug mumbled something about Karen being in a meeting. The other, Kyle, flipped through a folder with trembling fingers. Their panic was palpable, Perhaps they knew of the cabin fire. I cleared my throat. I need to see Karen now. My voice carried a distinct edge. Years of commanding a platoon had honed that tone. They exchanged uneasy glances, then Doug motioned down a narrow hallway. I followed it to a closed door with a frosted glass window. Inside, Karen's nasally voice drifted out, punctuated by the occasional staccato laugh. She sounded triumphant, confident, like she'd already gotten everything she ever wanted. Without knocking, I turned the handle. Karen jerked her head up from the folder in her hands. She wore a crisp navy blue blazer that seemed tailored for intimidation. Though it failed to conceal her wiry frame, her eyes flickered at the sight of my uniform, then her lips pulled into a forced smile. "Colonel Woodward," she said, dragging out each syllable, as though mocking my rank. "How nice to see you. I was just reviewing some new expansions for Rolling Acres. Is there something I can do for you?" I stepped closer, letting the desk remain between us, but ensuring she felt my presence. "Funny you mention expansions. My grandfather's cabin burned down last night. I'm sure you're aware that property sits on the very land you've been eyeing." I paused, searching her face for any crack in that smug veneer. She didn't blink. Her smile stayed frozen like wax. "Shame," she replied, voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "But accidents happen, Colonel. Old buildings are fire hazards, especially ones that might not meet modern codes." "Accident?" I repeated, swallowing back the rage boiling in my gut. "You'd better hope so. Otherwise, we're dealing with something far more serious." I noticed her right hand twitch near a stack of papers, possibly a reflex, or perhaps she was prepared to hide some incriminating document. She lifted her chin. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but if you're here to accuse me or the HOA, you won't find any backing. We have a robust network of supporters, we follow regulations, and we're not responsible for random fires. Now, unless you have official business, I'm very busy." I clenched my fists, not too tightly, just enough to channel my frustration into composure. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but I knew her game. She fed on intimidation, tried to provoke rash actions so she could twist them in her favor. Taking a shallow breath, I said, "I'll be investigating this, and I promise you, if I find the HOA had any involvement in destroying that cabin, you'll regret it." She offered a practiced shrug. "We'll see." Leaving that office felt like walking off a battlefield without firing a shot. It rankled my pride, but I had to be smart. I met up with Nate in the evening at the local diner. The neon sign flickered overhead as we settled into a corner booth. Nate was a compact man with a shaved head and a gaze that could pierce steel. He carried an old leather notebook stuffed with receipts, press clippings, and photos. "Took me half a day to dig up background on Karen," he said. Then he slid a few documents across the table. I skimmed them quickly. Turned out she had been a mid-level manager at some real estate firm before resigning under shady circumstances. Her finances didn't seem to match her reported income. There were unexplained deposits from a shell corporation tied to local development projects. Nate also discovered she had forged alliances with 2 city inspectors, each known to brush off code violations for a price. "The puzzle is coming together," he murmured, tapping his pen on the table. "She wants your land, either to sell to a big developer or incorporate it into Rolling Acres for higher association fees. And she doesn't take no for an answer." I sipped my coffee, the bitterness mirrored my mood. "So, you're thinking she had a hand in the fire?" I asked. Nate nodded. "That or one of her cronies. The cabin was an obstacle. If it's gone, you might be forced to negotiate or even give up the land altogether if you can't afford repairs or meet modern building standards. She could swoop in with an offer or pressure city officials to condemn the property." I exhaled, remembering Grandpa's stories about folks looking out for each other, how they once protected these lands from unethical logging companies. It seemed those days were long gone. So we gather evidence, I said softly. We prove she orchestrated this, then we take her down with enough force that her connections can't shield her. Nate's grin flashed like a wolf's. Exactly. Over the next week, I scoured the charred remains of the cabin with a flashlight and camera. Nate borrowed a friend's specialized equipment to check for accelerants. We found traces of a substance that suggested an accelerant had been used, though it wasn't conclusive. Meanwhile, I continued to observe the HOA's activities. Their bulldozers and earth movers appeared near the orchard, suspiciously close to my property line. They staked little orange flags in the ground, presumably marking spots for future expansion. One afternoon, I caught Karen pacing the edge of my land with a phone pressed to her ear. She noticed me, gave a smirk, and stepped away. I overheard fragments of her conversation. Yes, the council will approve. Once that eyesore is gone, don't worry, the colonel is stubborn, but we'll handle it. My jaw tightened. Her brazen confidence suggested she'd probably bribed or blackmailed enough local officials to push her agenda through. Feeling cornered, I decided to call in some reinforcements of my own. I reached out to an old friend, Captain Teresa Terry Alvarez, who had a knack for unraveling red tape. She'd spent years in the Army's Judge Advocate General Corps and was now working with a legal aid organization. When I explained the situation, she agreed to review any evidence we gathered and see if we could slam the HOA with a lawsuit or even criminal charges. But, she warned, we need something more concrete than gossip. We need a confession, a paper trail, or a credible witness. Nate and I set up a surveillance camera disguised as a birdhouse near the orchard. We also placed a small recording device by the property line hidden inside a hollowed fence post. Given Karen's arrogance, we hoped to catch her making incriminating statements. It was a risky move, but I was confident in my training. Patience and stealth had served me well overseas. Now, ironically, I was using them against a bureaucratic tyrant in a suburban sprawl. Days turned into nights. The camera quietly blinked away in the trees. Meanwhile, my interactions with the few supportive neighbors revealed a swirl of rumors. The HOA was pressuring older folks to sell their houses at below market prices, threatening them with fabricated violations. Another resident, Ms. Reed, confided that she'd received letters demanding she remove a rose garden that apparently clashed with the community's uniform aesthetic. She refused, and her plants mysteriously withered overnight, possibly sprayed with chemicals. Miss Reed blamed the HOA but had no proof. Fear anchored everyone's steps. They worried about retaliation, fines, forced evictions. Amid the tension, I found small moments to recall Grandpa's legacy. He was a proud, thrifty man who never bent to bullies. I refused to let his memory be tarnished. Every time I stepped onto that scorched patch of earth, I felt his spirit urging me forward. I gathered some unburned logs from behind the ruined cabin and stacked them as a makeshift memorial. One morning, I glimpsed Miss Reed leaving a bouquet of wildflowers there. She offered a sad smile but said nothing, as though words were too risky. After about 2 weeks, the camera finally captured something that set my pulse racing. Late one evening, Karen and a wiry man in a neon vest, possibly a contractor, ambled across the orchard's perimeter. The audio, though muffled, recorded Karen saying, "I told you to dispose of it discreetly. The colonel's land is the last piece we need. Once it's ours, the big company pays up." The man grumbled that the fire got out of hand, which made Karen hiss, "He has no proof. And if he tries to fight, we have the building inspector in our pocket." Then the recording cut off because they moved out of range, but it was enough. They were practically admitting to orchestrating the destruction of the cabin. I sent the file to Terry for analysis. She believed it was compelling, though not a perfect slam dunk. We'd need to corroborate it with other evidence or testimony. Nate suggested we track down the man in the neon vest. Maybe he was spooked. Maybe he'd flip on Karen if pressed. The next day, we scoured the neighborhood for that contractor. A rummage through the public records revealed a short list of local workers who had done HOA projects recently. By cross-referencing descriptions from neighbors who saw a tall, skinny guy with a safety vest, we finally landed on a name: Fred Wilcox. Fred lived in a dingy apartment complex on the outskirts of town. I went alone. My military instincts told me he might be more cooperative if I approached him politely without a crowd. He opened the door halfway, chain still on, and eyed my uniform. "Who are you?" he snapped. I introduced myself and explained I had questions about a contract job for Rolling Acres. He stiffened, tried to deny involvement, but when I mentioned the orchard, he paled. "I'm not responsible," he muttered, glancing nervously at the hallway. "Karen said it was just a small burn to clear the debris. Next thing I know, it's a roaring blaze. I swear I never meant to destroy anything valuable." The chain rattled as he shifted. "If she finds out I spoke to you..." "You don't understand," I replied quietly. "My grandpa's cabin was part of my family's heritage. Now it's gone. If you have any conscience left, tell me exactly what happened." He stared at the floor, exhaling shakily. "I was hired to remove brush near the orchard. Karen insisted the structure was condemned. She said no one would miss it, told me to burn it down so the city inspector could file a condemnation notice. I used accelerant, expecting a contained fire. It got out of control, and I panicked." My pulse pounded. Here was the confession we needed. "I'll keep you safe," I promised, "but I need your statement." He hesitated. Then his eyes darted to the plastic bag on his kitchen table, containing what looked like eviction papers. "Karen's got ties to people who could make my life miserable. I don't want trouble." I nodded, forcing empathy into my tone. "You're already in trouble, Fred, but if you cooperate, you stand a chance of avoiding jail and maybe living without constant fear." Reluctantly, he let me in, removed the chain, and gave a more detailed account of the incident. I recorded it with my phone, ensuring I had his verbal consent. The entire narrative matched the hints in the camera footage. Once finished, he sank onto a threadbare sofa, hands trembling. "She threatened me after the fire," he said, his voice shook. "Told me if I ever talked, she'd frame me for arson or worse. She's got the local building inspectors in her pocket." I patted Fred's shoulder. I recognized the same fear I'd seen in war-torn civilians who felt powerless against tyrants. "We'll protect you," I said. "Just stay quiet until we make our move." Then I slipped away into the evening, swirling with conflicting emotions: anger at Karen's ruthlessness, relief at having a key witness, and sadness that normal citizens were terrified to stand up for what was right. Next, I alerted Terry. She worked through the night drafting a preliminary lawsuit naming Karen and the HOA as responsible for property destruction, intimidation, and conspiracy to defraud. The plan was to file once we had enough momentum to ensure local corruption wouldn't bury the case. Meanwhile, Nate compiled a dossier on the city officials who might be complicit. We found a suspicious chain of phone calls between Karen and a city council member, later revealed by phone records that one of Nate's contacts managed to obtain through legal channels. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place. Then, a twist. Just as we were about to drop the legal bombshell, I received a letter from the municipality. Inside was a notice demanding I remove all unsafe debris from the homestead site within 15 days or face fines. They threatened daily penalties if I didn't comply. The letter was signed by a building inspector named Caldwell, someone rumored to be Karen's stooge. The notion that they'd force me to clear away the remains of my own burned property, essentially erasing evidence, was beyond outrageous. I realized they wanted to obliterate any last shred of proof that the cabin had existed, leaving me with nothing to tie them to the crime. That's when I decided to push back with the full weight of my rank and my honor. I might not have legal authority over them, but I did have a lifetime of leadership experience and a network of fellow servicemen and women who respected me. I contacted a local reporter named Ashley Shaw, who specialized in investigating small-town corruption. She'd once exposed a bribery scandal involving local law enforcement, so I trusted she wouldn't hesitate to confront the HOA. I provided her with a carefully curated overview of our evidence, nothing too detailed, just enough to pique her interest. She jumped at the chance, sensing a big story about corrupt HOAs preying on vulnerable residents. The next day, Ashley showed up in our neighborhood with a camera crew. Karen, evidently unprepared for public scrutiny, tried to stonewall them at the entrance. But Ashley had done her homework. She confronted Karen about the suspicious expansion plans, about the allegedly forced demolitions, and the role the HOA played in the cabin fire. Karen tried to laugh it off, labeling them sensationalist rumors. The tension escalated when Ashley mentioned Fred Wilcox by name. Karen's eyes flickered with panic. She insisted Fred was just a disgruntled contractor who took matters into his own hands. That statement contradicted Fred's recorded confession, which pinned Karen as the instigator. When the segment aired on a local TV station, the public response was immediate and fierce. Neighbors started to speak up, sharing stories of fines, threats, or sabotage. The following week, Ashley aired a second report featuring interviews with Miss Reed and two other residents who claimed the HOA had inflicted mental distress through harassment. Social media erupted with posts condemning Karen, labeling her HOA Queen of Destruction. She retaliated by calling a special board meeting to declare all these claims baseless and accusing me of orchestrating a smear campaign. The minutes from that board meeting, however, revealed an undeniable sense of panic. She was losing control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Terry finalized our lawsuit. Nate and I escorted Fred Wilcox to a notary public so he could sign an affidavit detailing every step of the arson. We also appended the audio from the orchard, plus the phone record evidence of Karen's suspicious calls. The final piece was a set of documents Grandpa had tucked away in a locked safe. Deeds, historical preservation notes, and a rare listing in the state's Heritage Preservation Registry for structures older than 50 years. Despite the cabin's current ruined state, the land and its structures held protected status. The association's destructive acts weren't just a matter of local property disputes, they violated state historical site protections. With all that in hand, we headed to the courthouse early one morning. The sun barely rose above the horizon, but I felt it glow with renewed hope. Terry filed the civil complaint plus a request for a temporary restraining order against the HOA to prevent them from further altering my land. We also included a motion to freeze certain HOA accounts, anticipating that if they tried to hide funds or funnel money to bribe officials, we'd catch them off guard. The judge assigned to the case was known for being impartial, a crucial factor in small-town drama. After reviewing the initial evidence, he scheduled an emergency hearing. Karen arrived with a smug expression and an expensive attorney from out of town. The hearing room was stark white, the fluorescent lights humming faintly. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to remain composed, recalling the countless times I'd stood before commanding officers with the fate of my men on the line. This was about Grandpa's legacy. I'd face it with dignity. Terry laid out our evidence systematically. She played the audio clip where Karen spoke of disposing of the cabin. She read Fred Wilcox's affidavit describing how he was instructed to burn it under the HOA's direction. Then she pointed out the contradictory statements Karen had given to the reporter, showing how she tried to shift blame. Finally, she presented the Heritage Registry documents indicating the property was protected. Karen's attorney tried to object multiple times, but the judge overruled. At one point, the judge asked Karen directly, "Ms. Alder, do you have any evidence to refute these claims that you authorized the fire?" Karen's face twitched. Her attorney whispered frantically. She insisted she had no knowledge, claiming Fred was a rogue contractor. but Terry calmly noted that HOA funds had paid Fred days before the incident, and messages from Karen's phone to Fred's contained references to torching the old place. Karen's attorney looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. It was the second day of the hearing when the real bomb dropped. Ashley Shaw entered the courtroom with a last-minute piece of evidence, an email chain she obtained from an HOA board member who'd flipped sides, revealing a discussion about how to remove Woodward's dilapidated shack to make way for a new community clubhouse. The email explicitly mentioned accelerating the process by any means necessary. Karen's name was at the bottom of one email with the phrase, "Do it soon or we'll lose the developer's bonus." The hush that fell over the courtroom was deafening. Karen's attorney tried to object, but the judge allowed it into evidence. By the end of that day, the judge granted our motion for a restraining order and indicated that a full trial would likely lead to civil damages, possibly even criminal charges against Karen and complicit officials. Karen, visibly shaken, hurried out of the courthouse. I heard from a local contact that she was frantically calling city council members, trying to salvage her position, but the tide had turned. The story had spread beyond local news, capturing regional attention. The State Historical Preservation Office opened its own investigation. Within 2 weeks, the City Council passed an urgent measure to suspend any new expansion requests from Rolling Acres, pending a thorough audit. Caldwell, the building inspector who threatened me with fines, was placed on administrative leave after internal emails surfaced that showed he'd falsified reports on the cabin's structural integrity. The entire power structure Karen had built around intimidation and payoffs started crumbling like rotten wood. As the lawsuit advanced, the HOA scrambled to distance itself from Karen. A majority of the board resigned, citing moral concerns. The association members demanded new leadership, outraged to discover how their fees were used for Karen's corrupt deals. Some even formed a residents' coalition, pledging to restore fairness and transparency. Ironically, the conflict Karen ignited had driven them to become more community-minded, reminiscent of the old spirit Grandpa once celebrated. I still remember stepping onto that blackened soil for the first time without the weight of fear or anger crushing me. It was dusk, the sky painted in oranges and purples. A hush fell over the orchard as though nature itself sensed the calm after the storm. Ms. Reed approached carrying a small sapling, a young oak. "For new beginnings," she said softly. "We planted it together, where the cabin's front porch once stood." I felt tears prick my eyes, not of sadness, but a deep gratitude that the land wouldn't remain a scar. It would become a symbol of resilience. Karen eventually faced criminal charges for conspiracy to commit arson and insurance fraud. The city found enough evidence of her involvement to file. The trial was pending, but she'd already lost her position, her reputation, and much of her wealth in legal fees. Rumor had it she tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering information on higher-ups in the developer circle. Whether that would mitigate her punishment remained to be seen, but at least she'd no longer torment innocent residents. One afternoon, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled up near the orchard. Out stepped a tall man in a crisp suit, an executive from the developer that Karen had worked with. He scanned the land with a critical eye, probably calculating how many millions they just lost. When he saw me approach in uniform, he forced a polite smile. "Colonel Woodward, I believe? We wanted to express our regrets for any misunderstandings." His voice dripped with corporate courtesy. I stayed silent, arms folded. Finally, he awkwardly offered a handshake, which I didn't accept. He retreated, leaving behind only the faint whiff of cologne and the sense that corporate greed had slithered out of our community for the time being. Weeks passed, the orchard turned green again. Terry discovered a little-known state grant for restoring historic sites that had been damaged by criminal acts. She helped me apply. The approval arrived a month later. We gained a modest sum to rebuild the cabin, enough to restore part of Grandpa's legacy. Perhaps it wouldn't be identical, but we'd use the same style of timber, replicate the vintage craftsmanship, and preserve the memory of what once stood. I decided to add a small plaque dedicated to all the neighbors who refused to be bullied by petty tyrants. On the day the restoration work began, I invited Miss Reed, Fred Wilcox, who'd turned witness, Ashley Shaw, Nate, Terry, and a few others who'd quietly supported us. We formed a circle in the orchard, standing where Grandpa's porch steps had been. I spoke briefly. I thanked them for their courage, for choosing community over intimidation. Then we broke ground. The clink of shovels felt cathartic, like a final exclamation that Karen's reign of terror was history. Some nights I still dream of Grandpa rocking on that old chair, the crickets chirping in the background, the orchard swaying in the summer breeze. In those dreams, the place is whole again, bathed in a soft golden light. When I wake, I feel an ache in my chest, but also a quiet resolve. I'm grateful we stood up against greed and corruption. It would have been easier to do nothing, to let fear consume us, but that's not how I was raised, and it's certainly not the Army way. They tried to push me around, thinking a uniformed man with too much pride would break under HOA bureaucracy. They were wrong. I was trained to hold the line in hostile territory, to defend those who couldn't defend themselves, and to outlast any barrage. Karen overlooked one crucial detail. I wasn't just some powerless homeowner. I was an Army colonel ready for war. And though I never fired a bullet here, we still triumphed on this suburban battlefield, emerging with honor intact and a community that found its spirit once again. When the final nails went into the new cabin beams, I stood back and felt a surge of hope. Birds nested in the orchard trees, bees buzzed around fresh wildflowers. The neighbors who once cowered were smiling and chatting over fences, planting their gardens without fear of ridiculous fines. The membership of Rolling Acres was reorganizing under fresh leadership, determined to be fair and transparent. And as for me, I kept my vow. Grandpa's land would remain a sanctuary. I knelt down by the new porch steps and pressed my hand to the wood. I imagined Grandpa's voice whispering about how justice always takes time, that eventually good people will band together to stop the bullies. Under that big open sky with the orchard stretching out in all directions, I felt the promise of better days, and that promise, etched in every beam of the rebuilt homestead, was something the HOA or any unscrupulous developer could never demolish again. We faced them head on. We uncovered the truth. We demanded accountability. It cost me sleepless nights, lost time, and heartbreak seeing Grandpa's beloved cabin burned to cinders. Yet in the aftermath, we learned a lesson about unity, about perseverance, about refusing to let greed snuff out cherished history. The orchard stands, resilient as ever, just like the new cabin walls rising to greet the dawn. If someone passes by Rolling Acres years from now and asks about the old place that burned, they might hear rumors of shady deals and a tenacious Army colonel who refused to yield. They'll see a renewed cabin, the plaque that honors a generation's struggles, and the orchard that still bears fruit despite the flames. Maybe they'll also hear how a once fearful neighborhood grew strong enough to defend itself from tyranny, all because an old man's legacy lit a spark of defiance in his grandson's heart. That spark spread until the entire HOA faced a reckoning, reminding everyone that some lines you just don't cross. In the end, HOA Karen stands as a cautionary tale for anyone who wields power without conscience. She learned that no amount of corruption or backroom deals can eclipse the will of determined people fighting for what's right. My grandpa's land remains a testament to that truth. There are places too precious, histories too meaningful, to be sold out or burned away. And whenever I walk across that rebuilt porch at twilight, whenever I lean on the railing he once carved, I feel his presence guiding me to guard this home for future generations. I will do so with unwavering resolve, for family, for community, and for the promise that no tyrant, no matter how connected, can ever take that away from us again.